So I went walking several places, but this tree I wanted to point out specifically because it's a very good tree to release a lot of bats on, especially eastern red bat and other bats that use trees for part of their habitat. So this is a shagbark hickory. Hickories in general are good for a lot of wildlife because they produce, if I can find it, they produce a lot of nuts. They have this casing like so, with varying degrees of thickness. And here's the small nuts. A lot of animals really like them. But shagbark hickory is really important for bats because of the bark. So if you look at the bark, it has these nice kind of gaps in here. And so a lot of bats like to hide in those areas during the day. So if you were releasing a bat back where it was found and you see this tree, this might be a good tree to put the bats in the little crevice to give them some shelter until they decide to take off. They may just take off anyway, but this is a good bat tree. And they're pretty common, thankfully, at least where I am in southwestern Virginia. And there's not really a lot of trees that have that kind of shaggy bark-like appearance. So overall, shagbark hickory is a great wildlife tree. This is a younger one that we're going to look at the leaves of. Shagbark hickories have a compound leaf. See how there's one bud leaves to this leaf that has a bunch of different leaves coming off of it. Here's another example. And this is typical of hickories, having that one bud, giving that big palmate leaf. So even though this young hickory, you can tell, you can't tell that it's shagbark yet. We can look at the leaves and be like, yay, shagbark, good tree. With eastern red bats, especially since they are kind of reddish colored, if you ever see patches of dead leaves like this, a lot of eastern red bats like to hide in those areas or near those areas because it actually camouflages them. They look a lot like dead leaves when they're hanging. So you also might want to select for red bats a tree that has a lot of dead leaves on it as well because they can hide there and roost there during the day. Here's another shagbark hickory that I found. Again, you can see the shaggy bark, those nice compound palmate leaves. I like this one because this tree a little bit better because you can actually see like how good those gaps are right there. And a lot of bats can hang out in there, and yep, it's a really good bat tree. So this dead tree here is really good for a lot of different kinds of wild animals. A lot of things that are cavity dwellers reside in these trees. So bluebirds, all species of woodpeckers, flying squirrels, screech owls, barred owls, even great horns will sometimes hang out in here. And so not only does this provide, a great food source for a lot of woodpeckers that like to dig through the wood looking for insects, but kind of towards the ground too, there can be places for wildlife as well as up high. And again, in our habitat talk, we talked about how habitat is really subjective, but these trees that allow these, small areas for small mammals to be up down low and then also up high and also a food source. In general, snags, having them around is generally a positive habitat feature because it does give variety in the environment. So you can do habitat evaluation or thinking about these things even if it's not your main goal. So I took this video after I noticed that this tree the previous day had lots of bird activity in it. And the next day when I was on my walk, I saw even more bird activity in this tree. Again, this is like mid-October or early October when I took this video, and there was about 20 or so warblers both days that were just hanging out in this tree. And I was like, well, we don't really think about the random trees at apartment complex as being a good place for wildlife to hang out. But this tree must be potentially a good tree for food for these migrating birds. And maybe this would be a place to check out if I had a warbler. Maybe I could release it into this flock in subsequent years if this is a good spot for them, because a lot of warblers during migration hang out together. So I'm trying to desperately get a good shot of the warblers in this video. So I later identified this tree using iNaturalist as a Coosa dogwood. And so, now I can file away that potentially Coosa dogwoods in early October would maybe be a good spot to consider releasing migratory warblers into. And there was about at least 5 or 6 different species, and I finally got one on film to show that I was telling the truth. But again, it wasn't my main purpose, but I learned something from just watching. So this plant is either a good or a bad plant, depending on how you feel about it. So this is autumn olive. It's an invasive plant. It has these green leaves on top. Underneath, they are like this kind of nice shimmery silver. They're kind of reflective. This is a bad tree because it takes over a lot of natural areas. It's very common as an ornamental plant. But it is a good bird tree. A lot of birds really like it because they like the fruit and then they spread it and then it gets everywhere. So it's not something that we want to encourage, but if you're looking for a good plant to either use in your repertoire of things that you can give your patients, here's another autumn olive that actually has the berries. It's a fairly common tree. It's pretty easy to identify. And if you have fruit-loving species, is it the best thing to encourage the growth of autumn olive? No. But if it's there already, animals and people aren't getting rid of it, wildlife might as well use it. It is a good wildlife tree, even though we do not want to encourage it. If you're not aware why we don't want to encourage it, it tends to choke out a lot of native plants, and they've done a lot of studies that have shown that areas that have higher amounts of native plants have higher diversity of wildlife, and those wildlife are able to survive a lot easier. So we don't want it around, but from a manager's perspective, I'd say burn this thing down. But from a rehabber's perspective, I'm like, great, I can release cedar waxwings here. I know that they'll have food for the next couple of days at the very least. So speaking of fruit areas, I came across 2 native plants here. There are wild grapes and pokeweed or pokeberry. And this area in general, again, would be good for cedar waxwings, but this is also a fantastic spot for things like brown thrashers and northern mockingbirds and gray catbirds. A lot of those species really like eating fruit, especially catbirds. I actually heard catbirds in the background while I was filming this video. But this is also a really nice shrubby area, and these kind of like dense shrubby areas are one of the favorites forest edge habitat for the mimids, so mockingbirds, catbirds, and brown thrashers. This is also good for a lot of small mammals, as well as a lot of sparrows, towhees, and those sort of animals. And looking at the interior of this plant, this is why I don't like outdoor enclosures that are just like super pristine and it's nice to see everything and it's really easy, because like, look at this. This is really dense. There's birds in here all the time. I'm familiar with this area. This thorny, dense vegetation prevents a lot of predators, like household cats can't get in here. So not only is it providing cover from predators, it's also providing thermal cover because it's so dense it can keep the elements out. And, when we have baby patients and we have everything looking all nice and easy to clean, it's like, well, that's not what they're dealing with when they're in the wild. We need to allow them to maneuver and practice maneuvering in these kind of spaces too. So I like dense outdoor caging personally. So the rest of these videos are all from the same location. It's a park that has a lot of different kinds of habitat types together, which is why I selected it. So when we first get to this park, there's this nice stream going through. Thinking about water is really important when thinking about wildlife, especially if they're water-dwelling animals. You need to pay attention to the substrate. So this is a predominantly sandy bottom, but some like rockier areas. A lot of salamanders like to be under the rocks rather than out in the open, even the aquatic ones. So if this is a little bit skinnier of a stream, maybe I'd release a seal salamander here, which is a more aquatic salamander. But you can also see there's some nice trees above too. But if we turn to the other side, so if we basically swivel the camera a little bit, so what would I release here? Well, rabbits might like this area. There are some more bushy areas further down that they could hide in, and they like these, they can get some grass here. I've seen robins foraging here, crows, a hawk might be able to come down and get a small mammal. I wouldn't release a squirrel right in this open area. I'd go closer to the trees. But this is a good spot for a lot of forest edge species. As you can see, there's the forest and there's a field. So a lot of forest edge, like cowbirds would like this. This flower right here is really good for a lot of goldfinches and finches. So that gives me like, that might be a good area for them, and I've seen them here before. But let's move a little bit further down. So this is the same area, it's a little bit more brushy. Again, rabbits would really like it here. I heard lots of cardinals while I was filming. This is why cardinals like being in kind of suburban-y areas, is we have a lot of vegetation that looks like this. I've also seen thrashers and mockingbirds here that, again, this kind of foresty edge, shrubby area is where they like to be. Moving a little bit farther down, I was looking at this fence row area. So a lot of sparrows like, if you ignore the fence, a lot of sparrows like this sort of area. It's very dense. There's lots of leaf litter on the ground, and a lot of the sparrows like to shuffle through the leaf litter. Towies are big in these sort of areas. And as I was looking, I was noticing this tree, which I think is a good tree to know. There are some wildlife that like this tree. This is American sycamore. They kind of have these maple leaf shaped leaves. I was trying to get a picture of the bark, but it has this really apparent camo bark. And American sycamores are usually where there's water. So this is a good sign that the soil is damp, if that matters for your species. Again, we have another open area, but this one's dominated by conifers or evergreens. Certain species have different preferences and might prefer this a little bit more. I like to release a lot of animals, especially during the winter where I know that there's evergreens, because it provides such good shelter because the leaves don't fall off. So this is going to keep a nice warm interior out of the wind and elements and the rain and the snow. So evergreens are your friend when releasing things. So this is a nice little thicket area that I thought was really great for rabbits, but a lot of smaller mammals, like some of the moles voles and shrews and stuff like that. Again, this is why I think it's good to get from your perspective. If you were a predator, it'd be kind of hard to get through here. Especially if you were bigger, like a fox or something like that. But for like a small rabbit or something, you're going to feel nice and protected there. So it's not always apparent from above. But yeah, I think this is a good spot for a lot of smaller mammals that like to hide that are not tree dwelling. Again, looking at the different habitat around, we have quite a bit of vegetation on top too. And there's this other area that I really, really liked, both as something that you can do in your cage design, but also as something that you can do or look for when you're releasing too. And this is almost like a literal natural shelter. It's where the vegetation has kind of grown up, but then leaves have also fallen on it to make it basically almost like a lean-to. And it'll come up in a second. Look here. So again, we got lots of, I'm trying to get in here. Look how dark it is in there. That's almost like a wall. That's going to keep a lot of animals safe and secure. Again, during bad weather or snow, it prevents, it's like a wind buffer too. So I like to build these sort of things both in enclosures, again, and as a good release feature. Leaf litter is an important feature for a lot of small mammals like shrews. Brown thrashers really like it. Sparrows really like it. Salamanders like it if it's wet. Preferably not with pavement underneath, but this is kind of like the thickest leaf area I could find. So just look out for places like that for some animals. When you're measuring canopy cover, if you're kind of curious on whether or not is this a closed canopy area, is this an open canopy, I like to take my phone up and take a picture, kind of like that. And then from that picture straight up, try to guess, I would say maybe this one's 40 to 50% canopy cover, maybe a little bit less. But that's how I would measure it if you're curious about measuring that metric. We're coming over to this big open area now. This is a good spot for a lot of raptors. So red-tailed hawks, both of the vultures. Crows would like this area. a lot of these animals need both large trees and forested areas, but they like to hunt in these open areas as well. This is a really active place for birds while I was here. The water also is a nice feature. I saw lots of phoebes, bluebirds were here. So some of the open field species this would be good for. The vegetation of the grass isn't great because it's not native grass, so we don't see as, preferably we like to see, oh, I saw a turkey vulture. What did I tell you? But we'd prefer a native grass area. This is also a good place for American woodcocks to display. Some of the meadow voles and field species would probably like this area. It's quite nice. Fence posts are pretty interesting because we don't really think them as being like a cool habitat feature for wildlife, but they actually are. So the tops of fence posts are good lookout points. They're good spots for animals to, snack on stuff. I'm actually going to pan over in a second and you'll see that someone has been snacking up here. Probably a squirrel or a chipmunk. But if you want to increase habitat diversity in an area that's relatively open, like a place like this, which is, this open field's the worst thing for wildlife. Bad. But if we wanted to easily increase diversity on it, we'd actually build a fence like this. Doesn't have to be anything super complex. But what's happening is birds from other areas are getting food, and they're sitting on these fence posts and either singing, or it's just a nice place to sit. And they're defecating, and they're literally planting their preferred vegetation along these fence rows. So fence rows can be actually like a really good spot for a lot of birds. Since this is next to a field, I see lots of field sparrows here, and things that like forest edges and field things. Eastern bluebirds, for example, like kind of open areas near where they breed, and a lot of these fence posts also have bluebird boxes on them as well. Kind of like that little shelter we saw earlier, evergreens, again, as I said earlier, have the same kind of function. But we're actually going to go in as best I can to kind of show that. So see how dark it is in here? Again, it's kind of hard for me to get in here. And it's also hard for especially avian predators to get in here, because look how thick all of this is. But it's pretty dark in there. That's, again, going to make a really good thermal shield from the elements. It's going to protect against wind, snow, rain, and predators. So I guarantee that during the winter, those trees have hundreds of birds in them, if not, several hundreds. So as we get into this more forested area, we're going to see more forest dwelling, and as we go further and further, it'd be better spots for kind of forest interior birds. I'll talk about that as we get there. But eastern gray squirrels, this is a great place for them. Fox squirrels, southern flying squirrels. Look, we got black walnuts, good food source. A lot of woodpeckers would still be in this area. But what's interesting is if you notice that even though we're starting to get, taller trees and thicker trees, we still have a lot of this, kind of brushy undergrowth still. It's not as dense as maybe some of the spots we saw earlier or have seen earlier in this video. Nice. But, we're getting this nice vertical diversity. Check out those nuts. So while we're adding new species as we're getting more developed forest, we're not losing species like brown thrasher, eastern towhee, that like some of the sparrows, white-throated sparrow, that are going to like this more brushy area. And again, this is what we're talking about with vertical diversity of different layers of forest rather than just having all tall trees or all shrubby areas. This is a pretty good diverse area for a lot of different niches for a lot of different animals to live in. Here's another great example of a snag. I mean, this tree is still a little bit living, but look at all these dead limbs. These are good vantage points for a lot of different animals, as well as, as they die and fall off, they make great snags, for nesting, and also as they fall off too, a lot of animals will like to live under these. So if you're ever having baby moles and are trying to figure out where the heck to release them, I think honestly near stream sides is kind of a good idea, especially if there's rich, moist soil that's pretty easy to dig through. A lot of the moles are actually semi-aquatic in that they can swim and catch prey in the water, which is kind of wild. This would be a good area for Coopers and Sharp-shinned hawks. Coopers and Sharp-shinned are more forest-dwelling hawks than the other hawks that we have here in Virginia. So I would release them here rather than in kind of like the big open areas. And I actually have wondered too whether or not this would be a better place to release red tails, because I've noticed that even though those open areas are usually where I see red tails, it also puts them a lot more out in the open for crows to go and find them. So I wonder if maybe releasing them, a couple, like 20, this is 20 feet from the field, but it looks a lot different, and perhaps it would provide a lot more cover to those birds temporarily, so they're not easily sighted by crows. But I haven't experimented with that. Maybe I'll experiment that in the coming year. But American kestrels wouldn't be here. Kestrels like open areas. They need open grassland areas with some trees that provide that have cavities for breeding. But this is not a spot for a kestrel, but great for Coopers and Sharp-shinned. Underneath logs is one of the places I might release some of the salamanders, because again, it will give them a little bit of cover. They can hide in the log or underneath the log. A predator is not going to be able to move that, rather than releasing a salamander out in the open. Same thing with like lizards and stuff as well, skinks, etc. Again, the habitat looks different, a lot different than it did before. We still have, it's getting a little bit more open than it was a little bit earlier. But we still have some really good vertical diversity. Look at this snag. This has been woodpecker central probably for many, many, many years. But this would be a good spot for species like yellow-billed cuckoo, where the forest is built up a lot more. But yellow-billed cuckoos are more tolerant of activity. So we have a lot of trees. The trees are still very dense. This would be a good spot for them. I see a lot of different migrant birds in this area. A lot of these trees have Virginia creeper growing on them, and Virginia creeper is a tree that's really important for a lot of the thrush species. I was like, ooh, great spot for a little mammal to hide. Especially like deer mice and stuff like that. So look out for those little things. And speaking of thrushes, this was robin central when I was here. There were robins everywhere. And honestly, it makes sense that they were everywhere. We're getting into migration, even though robins are year-round. Populations of them still do migrate. So they're forming these large flocks. And again, most of them were in this area where I know that there's a lot of Virginia creeper, which is probably what they're after, or other foods that are in this area. So having some knowledge of vegetation can be important, because it can give you clues as to who's going to be around when, what they're using, etc. I think this area is okay for a lot of small animals. It's not like perfect. I like this area here is pretty good. It's just lots of down logs, and a lot of the small mammals like down logs, smaller ground mammals, I should say. Not so much the tree guys, but yeah, this is where there were 8 million robins everywhere, although they don't show up very well on video. But we can see, if there were leaves on the trees, this would be a much more shaded area. The canopy cover would be a lot more. This is also a good area for great horned owls and screech owls. I've seen both species here. And again, I mentioned woodcocks earlier. This is also a prime area for woodcocks, because they also like to be in the forest as well. Coming over here to the leaf litter. This is probably the deepest leaf litter I've seen so far today. A salamander would be nice and happy under there, especially if it was a little bit more moist. It's pretty dry underneath the log. Good spot for food too. Leaf litter is your friend. Oh, and shrews would really like it here as well. This big tree, again, there's lots of dead limbs, and I see cavities in there, which is great for cavity nesters. These big trees, like this is a white oak too, so it produces a lot of nuts for a lot of different animals. So white oak is a big, big wildlife tree. It's a good one to know. There's a cavity. And this is a little early successional area over here where we got some trees, but they're really not that much taller than me. Things like prairie warblers, yellow-breasted chats, some of like the meadow species like hispid cotton rats would probably like this a lot better. You're not going to get, again, yellow-billed cuckoos using this area as much. It's primarily going to be these earlier successional species. Lots of sparrows. Sparrows would probably like this area. But we also have, that big dead tree over there. That's a good spot for, woodpeckers and other birds to hang out on too. So, yeah. So that's more or less it. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more of a visual of kind of some of the things that I look for and I'm talking about and what these different, words mean. Yeah, I hope it helps. Thanks for watching.